Justice in Viking times was as harsh as the northern winters. A thief might face hot irons pressed to his flesh, while an oath-breaker could be dragged to icy waters and left to fate. Some punishments were so strange, they defied reason designed not only to hurt the body, but to shame the soul. In a world where honor meant everything, these punishments kept order through fear and fire. And today, we uncover the most bizarre punishments from Viking times and more. At dawn, when the mist still clung to the fjord and the gulls wheeled overhead, the people gathered. It was not a feast nor a raid, but something older, graver, and just as binding to the life of the North, the Thing. Here, beneath the open sky, the most bizarre punishments, from Viking times and more, were not whispered legends, but living law, spoken aloud by the law speaker, whose memory held centuries of custom. The air was heavy with expectation, for each man, woman, and Viking child knew that what was decided upon this field would ripple through kin and clan alike. In this ring of men, with cloaks drawn tight, honour was weighed, vengeance measured, and lives could be spared or broken. The Thing was no mere gathering. It was the spine of Viking life, the place where disputes were untangled like snarled fishing nets. A Viking man accused of theft stood at the circle's edge, his kin behind him, their eyes steady. To one side, the offended family, fists clenched at their belts. Between them, the law, not written on parchment, but carried in the breath of the law speaker, who raised his staff and called silence. The crowd hushed, for the voice of the law was older than any chieftain. Each word was as binding as iron. Oaths were sworn, not lightly, but with the weight of gods as witness. A hand laid upon a ring of sacred silver. The swearer spoke of truth, his voice trembling or firm, depending on his courage. Perjury was not just a lie, it was a curse upon one's own bloodline. To break an oath before the Thing meant ruin, for the Viking believed the gods themselves bent their ears to hear whether men stood true or faltered. Justice was not cloaked in shadow. It was spoken openly, before the gaze of all, for shame was a punishment sharper than any blade. Yet the Thing was not only a stage for punishment, it was also the forge of reconciliation. A killing could be answered with blood, yes, but the Thing allowed for another path, Wergild, the man price. Silver, cattle, or land could settle a feud that might otherwise rage for generations. A Viking family might count out their wealth to spare the spear, while another accepted it, their pride tempered by the need for peace. Still, refusal was common, and when silver failed, the feud lived on, staining the earth red until balance was restored. The law, speaker's role was perilous. He remembered every law, recited them before all, and could bend the crowd with a well-placed phrase. His memory was the court, his voice the parchment. When he named outlawry, the crowd stirred, for it was no light decree. Lesser outlawry drove a man from hearth and kin for 3 winters, a punishment harsh but survivable. Full outlawry, however, stripped him of protection entirely, turning him into prey for any who wished his death. To be declared outside the law was to become a ghost among the living, a shadow skulking beyond the firelight of the Viking hall. And so the Thing endured, season after season, as constant as the tides. Here, Viking food was shared to steady tempers, skalds listened for tales that would echo into song, and enemies stood face to face, bound by the weight of the circle. No roof shielded the Thing, for the sky itself was judge, and no sword alone decided guilt, for it was the people's will that sealed a man's fate. This was the root of justice in the North communal, unflinching and spoken aloud. To stand at dawn in that circle was to feel the raw edge of law, not softened by walls or kings, but shaped by kin, blood, and the gods' silent watch. The Thing was the heart of Viking justice, where punishments strange and severe were born, and where the voice of the people carried heavier than steel. The crack of an axe in wood, the clash of swords on the field, and sometimes the sudden silence of a man's last breath these were not uncommon sounds in the north. Yet, among the Vikings, death did not always end in vengeance. There was another path, older than kings, and written not in ink, but in memory, Wergild, the price of a life. To the Viking man, it was a grim arithmetic, a tally of silver and cattle weighed against blood spilled. The belief was simple, better to trade coin than corpses, though the balance was seldom so clean. At the Thing, when families gathered to demand justice, Wergild might be spoken like a spell. A slain Viking child could stir an ocean of grief, but grief alone could not hold back the spear. So, tables were remembered, recited by law speakers, who carried them like sacred scripture. A thrall's life might fetch a handful of silver, no more than the worth of his labour. But the life of a freeman, or worse still, a chieftain's kin, was measured by greater sums, rings of silver, broad lands, or herds that could feed a hall through winter. For every wound, there was a value, for every limb lost, a price. Even the breaking of teeth, or the loss of an eye, found its place in the grim catalogue. The Viking did not call this mercy, it was balance. But silver was never just silver. Each coin bore the weight of kinship and honour. A Viking woman who lost her brother might accept the Wergild, not because it soothed her sorrow, but because it restored the standing of her house. Without it, her family's honour would be seen as broken, open to insult, perhaps even ruin. Yet not all wounds could be salved with treasure. Some families spat upon the silver, refusing to trade grief for coin. In their eyes, vengeance alone could cleanse the stain. Then the feud would rise, a storm of fire and steel stretching across generations. Wergild demanded courage of another kind. To pay meant admitting guilt. To accept meant letting go of wrath. Many a Viking hall saw the tense moment when silver was counted out, ring by ring, while the crowd held its breath. Would the bereaved nod, closing the feud, or would they hurl the silver back, choosing blood over peace? Some sagas tell of men who lifted the payment with trembling hands, only to return home and sharpen their swords anyway. Still, the system endured because it gave the North a chance to breathe between wars. It allowed Viking food to be shared again at feasts where enemies once glared across the fire. It gave children a chance to grow without watching their fathers march to endless slaughter. For a land where steel was never far from hand, Wergild was the closest thing to peace, fragile though it was. The law speakers remembered curious details. A blow that crippled might be worth more than a killing, for the living victim carried shame, pain, and burden upon his kin. A noble's death might demand silver so vast that a poorer family could never pay. In such cases, exile often followed, for a man unable to balance his blood debt had no place among his people. He became an outlaw, neither shielded by kin nor by law, condemned to die like a beast if found. Thus Wergild was more than a transaction. It was a mirror of the Viking soul, showing how they measured honour, wealth, and life itself. To them, it was not cruelty, but order and attempt to keep the tide of vengeance from drowning every hall in blood. And yet, beneath the silver gleam, the old truth lingered. Some wounds cannot be priced, and some grudges will only sleep until steel wakes them again. There were fates among the Vikings worse than the sword, punishments that cut a man away from kin, hearth, and even the gods. To be outlawed was to be slain without dying, to walk the earth as one already buried in the eyes of the people. The Thing knew two such decrees, lesser outlawry and full outlawry. Together, they were the sharpest edge of Viking law, for no chain nor dungeon held a man so firmly as the scorn of his own folk. Lesser outlawry was a punishment of years, not forever. A Viking man cast beneath its weight was driven from his land, from his longhouse, from the fellowship of his kin for 3 winters. In that span, he was forbidden to raise axe beside his people, forbidden to sit at the benches where Viking food was passed in steaming bowls, forbidden to call upon the protection of law. Yet there was still a thread of hope, if he endured. if he kept the exile without breaking further taboos, he might return. But those winters were hard. He wandered like a wolf, scratching for shelter, always fearing the spear of those who no longer called him brother. Full outlawry was another matter. It was civic death, a tearing away of every bond. The man declared full outlaw was called a wolf in the sacred places. No roof could shield him, no oath could defend him, and no law could avenge him. Any who found him might cut him down as they would a rabid beast, and not a soul would dare speak for mercy. He could not gather wood from the forest, for even the trees stood under the law of the people. He could not drink from the well, for the water itself was denied to him. His name became ash on the lips of his kin, who mourned him though his heart still beat. To see such a decree spoken at the thing was to witness a living death. The law speaker would raise his voice above the crowd, and when the sentence of outlawry was declared, the people would stir as if a shadow passed over the field. Mothers pulled their Viking children closer, men muttered, and the condemned felt the air grow colder around him. No sword blow could strike deeper than that moment, when every eye turned away and every bond was cut. Some sagas tell of men who wore outlawry like a cloak, turning the wilderness into their hall, the bow and blade into their only kin. They lived by raiding, by thievery, or by the mercy of wanderers who dared feed them in secret. But each day was a gamble, for the next dawn might bring a hunter's spear or the stroke of a sword from one eager to prove himself against the wolf-man. Even those who survived long years in outlawry carried the mark of it forever, their names recited in whispers, their honour never fully restored. Why did the Vikings wield so cruel a punishment? Because the weight of kinship was the marrow of their world. To strip a man from it was to unmake him. Blood feuds could be settled by silver. Oaths broken could be healed with ritual. But a man who betrayed the order of the community beyond forgiveness was cast into nothingness. Outlawry kept the hearth safe, without filling the earth with more graves, yet it was a doom feared even by the fiercest. So it was that outlawry, lesser or full, stood as a warning to all who walked beneath the northern sky. Among the Vikings, death might come by axe, but dishonour came by decree, and of the two, it was often the decree that men feared most. Blood upon the earth was never left to vanish quietly among the Vikings. When a man fell by sword or spear, the wound bled far beyond his own flesh. It seeped into kin, into neighbours, into the very honour of the clan. Feud was not chaos. It was law, older than kings, sharper than runes carved on stone. The feud bound families together as tightly as it tore them apart, for in it lay the unspoken rules of vengeance, arbitration, and alliance. A Viking man slain on the field of quarrel did not die alone. His brothers, cousins, and uncles all bore the burden of his death. To leave it unanswered was shame unbearable, a weakness that made the family prey to insult and ruin. Thus vengeance rose not as madness but as duty. A sword might be drawn, a hall set ablaze, or a Viking child's inheritance secured in blood. Yet, even in fury, there was measure. The feud was not a flood without banks, it flowed within the channels of custom. The thing was where vengeance could be weighed, not to erase it, but to steer it. A family might demand wergild, a blood price in silver and cattle, to soothe the wound. Others refused coin and took blood instead, yet even this was counted. One life for another, not 10 for one, lest the feud consume both houses like fire in dry grass. Arbitration was the art of the wise chieftains and law speakers stepping between foes, offering terms that might hold the peace, at least for a season. For a Viking hall could not thrive if it was forever at war with its neighbour. The winter was too long, the soil too lean for endless slaughter. Marriage, too, was a weapon of peace, as sharp in its own way as the edge of steel. A daughter of one clan might be given to the son of another, not as kindness, but as binding rope. Her children would carry both bloodlines, and the feud's fire would cool for fear of burning its own kin. Many sagas tell of such unions, sometimes thriving, sometimes brittle, but always forged in the crucible of vengeance. A Viking woman, stepping into the hearth of her family's foes, was as much a shield as any warrior upon the field. Yet there were times when rules frayed, when blood for blood became a spiral without end. Feuds could stretch across generations, grandchildren raising the sword for an insult their grandsires had uttered. Still, the memory of law pulled even the wildest back from the brink. The feud was never meant for annihilation. To wipe out a family utterly was to court outlawry, to earn the contempt of all, for who then would remain to keep the balance of the world? Even in rage, the Vikings knew the edge between justice and ruin. At the long fire, skalds would sing of vengeance done rightly, of honour restored through bold strike or wise settlement. The songs were reminders to Viking children that feud was both peril and path, a road one must tread carefully. For while steel was swift, honour was enduring, and without honour a man was less than thrall. Thus feud lived as law among them, a harsh and perilous compass. It bound Viking man to kin, forced him to reckon with his deeds, and gave shape to the storms of grief and rage. To walk the line of feud was to walk the razor's edge, where one wrong step could plunge a family into darkness, yet the right one could weave strength and kinship that endured beyond death. It was law written not in ink but in blood, and the Vikings knew it well. When words failed, and silver could not soothe the quarrel, the Vikings turned to a harsher judge, the holmgang, trial by steel. To the Viking man, honour was not a cloak that could be mended with coin alone. It was bone deep, and when insult struck too deeply, only the edge of iron could decide truth. The holmgang was no brawl born of ale fumes in a smoky hall. It was ritual, measured and stark, a duel framed by law as surely as the thing itself. The field of combat was marked before the fight began, often a cloak or hide spread on the earth, sometimes no larger than a small hearth. Two men stood within it, their feet bound by custom not to wander, their lives balanced on narrow ground. Step outside the marked space 3 times, and the duel was lost. Shields were counted sometimes 3, sometimes more, each to be shattered before the body must meet the blow unguarded. The crowd gathered silent around, kin and strangers alike, watching not merely for blood, but for the proof of courage. In saga after saga, the holmgang is remembered. A Viking child, hearing the tales at the fireside, would learn that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. The combatants faced each other as men bound by fate, not rage. There were rules to limit the storm of steel, no ambush, no strike upon the fallen until the crowd had judged it fair. Champions could be chosen in place of the challenged, and many a Viking thrall, fierce and desperate, fought for his master's honour in such trials. Yet the holmgang was not only about vengeance. It was a way to prevent greater feuds. Rather than setting 2 families at endless war, 2 men or their chosen champions might resolve the quarrel with one brief clash. A wound, even a shallow one, could be enough to prove a point. Sometimes blood on the ground was counted as justice, sparing the rest from a spiral of slaughter. And yet, as often, the holmgang ended in death, a life given to silence the quarrel forever. But steel has a way of breeding hunger. Some warriors grew greedy for holmgang, calling out rivals to seize their land, their women, or their wealth. A skilled duelist might rise like a storm, forcing others to yield under the guise of law. In such hands, the holmgang twisted from justice into a weapon of tyranny. It was said some men carried scars like trophies, each cut a sign of another victory. As the years passed, kings and chieftains began to weary of this bloody custom. The thing itself, which had once upheld the holmgang as lawful, sometimes moved to forbid it, fearing that trial by steel was tearing the bonds it was meant to bind. The law spoke more loudly in the Christian age, declaring that oaths and silver should weigh more than the axe. Still, in the deep halls and on lonely fields, men clung to the old way. For to many Vikings, no judgment from priests or kings could match the truth of two men standing face to face, weapons bare, fate waiting. Holmgang was the mirror of Viking life itself, harsh, ritualized, and unflinching. It showed a people who believed that honor was not to be debated, but tested, that truth was not whispered, but struck into flesh. And though the law would one day turn its face from the duel, the memory of it endured in saga and song, where men still stood upon the small cloak of earth, and let steel, not words, carve their justice. Among the Vikings, a man's word was more than sound upon the air. It was binding sinew, a rope that tied him to kin, to gods, and to fate itself. To break that rope was to shatter more than trust, it was to bring ruin. Oathbreakers and perjurers stood lowest in the Viking world, despised more than thieves, more than cowards, for they poisoned the well from which all law and honour were drawn. At the Thing, oaths were not spoken lightly. A Viking man would step forward before the gathered folk and lay his hand upon a hallowed ring of silver, or touch the godstaff that marked the presence of the divine. The air grew still as he spoke, for his words were not his alone. Odin the Oathkeeper, Thor the Guardian of Truth, and Freya, who blessed the harvest, all were called to witness. His voice was steady, or it was not, but once spoken, the oath clung to him like iron shackles. A false word uttered here was no mere lie, it was a crack in the order of the world. To swear falsely was to invite the wrath of men and gods alike. A perjurer might walk away from the circle, but he carried with him a stench of dishonour that no Viking food nor drink could wash away. He was shunned at feasts, denied a place at the benches, eyed with suspicion even by kin. No warrior would trust him in the shield wall, for what worth was a man who could not hold his tongue true? To be branded an oathbreaker was to be marked for life, and even before punishment was dealt, the punishment had already begun. Yet punishments there were, sharp as any axe. At times the perjurer was fined heavily, stripped of silver until he stood poor and humbled. At times he was declared lesser outlaw, cast from the hearth for years, forced to scavenge like a wolf at the edge of men's lands. In the most grievous cases, when a false oath had led to blood unjustly spilled, or kinships torn, full outlawry might be declared. Then the oathbreaker was no longer man, but prey, a wolf in the sacred places, doomed to die by any hand that found him. But harsher still was the weight of shame. A Viking child, told of his father's treachery, would carry it like a brand upon his brow. Generations might labour to scrape the stain away, for sagas remembered oathbreakers with venom, and skalds made certain their names soured in every hall. The gods themselves were thought to strike such men. Ill luck fell upon their ships, storms dashed their sails, sickness crept through their households. A broken oath was a curse that spread like frostbite, blackening all it touched. Not all swearing was grim. Oaths bound comrades in fellowship, warriors pledging loyalty before battle, men swearing blood brotherhood with mingled veins. Such vows lifted the spirit, for they tied hearts together under the eyes of gods. But it was this very sacredness that made betrayal unthinkable. A Viking man who betrayed an oath of brotherhood was cast lower than thrall, despised more than a murderer, for he had severed what was meant to be unbreakable. Thus the Vikings feared the perjurer, not only for his own dishonour, but for the danger he brought upon all. To live among such a man was to risk contagion, for lies corroded law as rust devours steel. Better a neighbour who stole a cow than one who swore falsely, for the cow could be returned, but broken trust could not. So the law stood firm, and the people guarded it with sharp eyes and sharper memory. Among the Vikings, oaths were the mortar of their world, holding together kinship, trade, and peace. To shatter one was to break the very walls of life, and those who did so walked only a short road before shame or steel overtook them. There were wounds in Viking society deeper than steel could carve, cuts made not by sword but by word. Among these, none struck harder than Neath and Urgi, the crimes of shame. To call a man a coward, or worse, to brand him unmanly, was no jest whispered in a smoky hall. It was fire flung into dry straw, a spark that could set clans ablaze. In a world where honour was a man's armour, such words could strip him bare, leaving him weaker than any wound to the flesh. Neath was more than insult. It was slander sharpened to a deadly edge, words meant to blacken a man's name before kin and gods alike. To accuse a Viking man of theft, sorcery, or betrayal without proof was to brand him with a stain he could not wash off. The law gave weight to this. Neath spoken falsely could itself be punished as severely as a blow with a blade. Yet when spoken with truth, or believed by enough voices, it was a weapon greater than steel. A man marked with Neath might find doors closed, friends silent, and his kin ashamed to share mead beside him. Urgi cut even deeper. To accuse a man of being, Urgi was to question his very standing as a warrior, as a free man, as a Viking. It carried the stink of unmanliness, of weakness in battle, or submission where none was allowed. Such an accusation was not spat lightly, for it could ignite blood feud faster than theft of cattle or burning of fields. To brand a warrior, Urgi before his peers was to drive him to holmgang, for no Viking could let the word linger on the air unchallenged. Better to risk death by steel than to live with such a shadow clinging to his name. The force of Neath and Urgi did not end with speech. They were carved into poles and curses, raised in the form of the Neath stang. A Viking might slaughter a horse, mount its head upon a stake, and carve runes of contempt against his foe. Such sorcery of insult called down gods and spirits to join the dishonour. To see one raised against your homestead was to feel the weight of doom. For not only men but unseen powers now turned against you. The sagas hold many tales of these crimes of shame. One tells of a Viking child who grew to manhood under whispers of Urgi spoken against his father. When he reached his first battle, he fought like a wolf, starved in winter, not only for victory, but to burn away the word that had haunted his kin. Another speaks of men who answered Neath, not with duel, but with fire, setting whole halls aflame, so that no tongue could repeat the slander. Why did these words carry such weight? Because, in a world where honour was life, shame was death. A man might lose wealth and win it back, lose land and reclaim it, but once stripped of honour, he stood as empty as a thrall, no matter the rings upon his arm. The Viking food placed before him at feasts would taste of ashes, for every eye at the table saw not a man, but a husk hollowed by insult. Thus Neath and Urgi were crimes both spoken and received, punishments woven of air and belief, yet heavier than iron chains. To wield them was to gamble with blood, for few could endure their weight without striking back. And so, in the law of the North, the sharpest blade was not always forged of steel, but of words sharpened in the mouth, loosed like arrows, and remembered long after the speaker was dust. There were punishments among the Vikings that cut deeper than exile, and more enduring than the stroke of a sword. Among them stood the Nidstang, the pole of contempt. This was no common curse muttered in the dark, but a public shaming, a spell of hatred raised high for all to see, and for the gods themselves to witness. To face such a pole was to feel your very soul stripped bare, for it bound not only you, but your kin, your land, and the spirits that dwelled about your hall. The making of a Nidstang was a ritual of venom. A Viking man who had been wronged by theft, betrayal, or insult too heavy to bear would slaughter a horse, often the fiercest or strongest beast he owned. Its head, dripping with blood, was mounted upon a tall pole carved with runes of mockery. The eyes of the horse, lifeless yet glaring, were turned toward the enemy's home, so that every passing soul, man or spirit, knew where the curse was aimed. Around the head, the avenger would carve words of contempt, naming his foe a coward, a breaker of oaths, or worse, ergi unmanly in the eyes of the world. It was not enough to kill the beast and set the head aloft. The one who raised the pole spoke words like fire, calling upon the gods and land spirits to turn against the target. The wind was asked to strip his fields, the sea to swallow his ships, the earth to sour beneath his plough. The nithstang was thus both insult and weapon, a blending of shame and sorcery. And because it was public, raised high for the whole district to see, the stain it cast was near impossible to wash away. To have a nithstang raised against you was more than dishonour. It was a sign you had become outcast in spirit, even if the thing had not declared you outlaw. Neighbours grew wary, for who wished to share Viking food or mead with one cursed so openly? Kin might turn away in shame, fearing they too would share in the contempt. Even the gods were thought to look askance at a man beneath such a curse, for if his honour was soiled, what offerings of his could carry weight? The sagas tell of men driven near mad by the sight of the pole. Some would strike back in rage, raiding the homestead of the one who raised it, hoping to erase their shame with steel. Others sought to answer curse with curse, setting their own nithstang to glare back across the fjord, so that two farms stood beneath the watching eyes of horseheads, their feud echoing, not in blood alone, but in the very spirits of the land. And there were some who fled, unable to endure the constant reminder that they had been named faithless before all. For Viking children, tales of the nithstang were warnings. To act without honour, to betray oath or kin, was to risk not only punishment by men, but contempt carved into wood and horseflesh, lasting long after the act itself. Such stories reminded them that reputation was a living thing, fragile as glass, strong as iron, and once broken, not easily mended. So the pole of contempt stood as one of the most feared punishments of the age, for it was not quick like the axe, nor limited like a fine of silver. It was slow poison, sinking into a man's life, his kin, his land, until even the spirits whispered his shame. To be slain by sword was an end. To be struck by a nithstang was to be unmade in life, undone in memory, and left as nothing but a warning carved upon a pole beneath the northern sky. Among the Vikings, freedom was the marrow of honour. A man's place at the thing, his right to bear arms, his voice in oath and feud, all were bound to the truth that he stood free. To lose that freedom was a doom heavier than chains, for it stripped a man not only of power but of self. This was thraldom, slavery by sentence or by capture, a punishment that dragged thieves, debtors, and the defeated into the harshest bondage of the north. A Viking man who stole from his neighbour, or who failed to pay debts sworn upon sacred silver, might find himself standing before the assembly without shield or kin to defend him. If outlawry was too harsh a remedy, thraldom was chosen instead. The guilty was seized and given over, body and labour now belonging to the household he had wronged. His hands that once held the axe or plough now bent to another's will, his voice silenced in the thing, his fate no longer his own. To be a thrall was to live without honour. Viking children of such men were born into bondage, their names little more than tools upon a tally. A thrall's word carried no weight in oath, no strength in law. He ate Viking food only when it pleased his master, worked from dawn until nightfall, and could be traded or gifted like cattle. In halls and farms, thralls turned the soil, tended the herds, hauled timber, and sometimes warmed the beds of their masters, though even such service was a mark of shame rather than privilege. But thraldom was not reserved for the guilty alone. Raids across seas and rivers brought back captives from Ireland, the Baltic, and the Saxon lands, folded into Viking households as spoils of war. To be taken in such a way was to lose one's world in a heartbeat, family torn away, language drowned by the speech of strangers, life reshaped into service. Yet, for those condemned by law at home, the sentence bore a sharper sting. They had once been free, and now were nothing. Still, Even within this dark fate, there flickered strange threads of hope. A master might grant freedom after years of loyal labour, allowing a thrall to rise again, though never without the lingering shadow of his past. Silver could sometimes buy release if kin or friends scraped enough to ransom him back. And in rare tales, thralls proved so cunning or brave that they rose to become trusted companions, even freedmen who carved their own place among the folk once more. Yet these were exceptions, shining against the grim truth that most thralls lived and died as property. The punishment of thraldom served the community as both warning and necessity. It shamed the guilty, enriched the wronged, and kept hands working in a land where toil was constant. A thief who once stole might be set to guard the very herds he had coveted, his life now an unending repayment. A debtor who squandered silver might spend years bent over the earth, his back bowed beneath the burden of his folly. And all who watched learned the lesson. In a Viking world where honour and freedom were prized above all, to lose them was a fate worse than death. So it was that thraldom stood as one of the harshest sentences of the North, not as sudden as axe or spear, not as final as outlawry, but lingering, grinding, stripping the spirit day by day. For the Vikings, it was a reminder that freedom was fragile, and that shame was not always written in blood. It could also be carved into a life of endless service, where even breath and bone belonged to another. Among the Vikings, the clash of axes on foreign shores was praised in song, yet the same deeds turned inward brought only shame and punishment. Theft, arson, and sea raids at home were not celebrated conquests, but crimes that cut at the roots of kinship. A Viking man might take cattle across the sea and boast of it, but if he stole from his neighbour's pasture, the law rose against him with a fury as cold as the northern wind. Cattle and sheep were not mere beasts, they were the marrow of survival. A Viking child grew on their milk, their hides warmed the family in winter, their flesh sustained the haul when storms made the seas impassable. To steal stock from another's field was to strike directly at his kin's very breath. The law codes recited stiff penalties, fines heavy in silver or livestock equal to what was stolen, sometimes doubled if the theft was done in secret by night. A repeat thief could be stripped of freedom itself, sold into thraldom, his labour now the property of the very men he had wronged. Arson was a crime even darker. To burn a man's farmstead was to erase his shelter, his livelihood, and the memory of his ancestors in one cruel blaze. Flames devoured not only timber and thatch, but also the carved posts that marked the family's place in the world. Punishment for such a deed was seldom left to silver alone. Many times, the fire raiser was hunted like a wolf, brought to the Thing and driven into outlawry. To be known as a burner was to be marked forever, for the community feared a man who set fire to the heart of the homestead. Sea raids against distant lands filled the coffers of Viking chiefs and earned men fame, but raiding within the fjords was another matter entirely. To attack neighbours, to fall upon kin, across the waters of the same district, was to unravel the fragile bonds that kept the people whole. Such crimes were met with swift retribution. The Thing declared them no better than treachery, and the raiders risked outlawry or death, for the Vikings knew that their strength lay in unity at home. Without it, no longship could sail far. Community boundaries mattered in ways deeper than stone walls or wooden fences. They marked the edge between war and peace, between kin and foe. To violate those lines with theft or fire was to mock the very idea of belonging. A Viking woman, preparing food for winter, could not guard her stores if her neighbours turned predator. A Viking child could not sleep safe by the hearth if raiders prowled the next farmstead. The law was clear: unity within the district, war without. Break that balance, and you became no better than a beast devouring its own kin. Yet even here, law sought measure. If the thief returned what was stolen and paid proper wergild, if the arsonist's kin offered silver and cattle to heal the wound, peace could be restored. Arbitration was tried before blood feud consumed both households, but when pride overruled reason, vengeance followed swiftly. Fires answered fire, and boats slid quietly across moonlit waters, turning neighbour against neighbour, until the fjord itself seemed poisoned with distrust. So theft, arson, and sea raids at home carried heavier weight than many battlefield killings. They were crimes not just against one man, but against the very weave of Viking society. To strike a neighbour was to weaken the shield wall of the community, leaving all more vulnerable to hunger, storm, and foreign steel. And so the law stood firm, punishing with silver, exile, or death to guard the fragile bond that held kin and land together. For the Vikings knew well, honour could be won abroad, but it was lost forever if the hearth at home was set aflame. In the Viking world, there were places where even the sharpest sword was meant to rest in its sheath. The halls of the gods, the open field of the Thing, the ground beneath the sacred groves, these were spaces where peace was more than custom, it was law woven with divine breath. To shed blood in such places was no mere crime, it was a wound struck against the gods themselves. And for that, the penalties were doubled, tripled, and sometimes so heavy that no silver or Viking food could mend them. The temple stood as the beating heart of faith, its posts carved with runes, its altars glimmering with offerings of gold rings, cattle horns, and carved idols. A Viking man who lifted hand against another here risked far more than the vengeance of kin. He risked exile and the god's curse upon his house. To strike blood upon holy soil was to defile the very space that shielded the people, and so the fine for such a deed was magnified beyond measure. Some law songs told it plain, the man who wounded another in the temple must pay thrice the usual wergild, and if he could not, he must flee, for the wrath of both gods and men would hunt him. The Thing was no less sacred. Though it was not a temple roofed with timber, it was holier still, for there the community gathered under the eye of the gods to speak law and oath. To draw a weapon at the Thing was to spit upon that peace. Even a Viking child knew the hush that fell when the law speaker raised his staff, for in that moment the field itself was hallowed. Any man who broke the silence with violence faced punishments heavier than outlawry. Alone he was seen as a breaker of society, a wolf among men, and his name carried shame across generations. Such rules were not softness, they were survival, for without sacred spaces there could be no order, no trust that a man could step onto holy ground unarmed and be heard. A Viking woman might bring her plea to the Thing, a widow demanding payment for her slain kin, and she had to stand without fear that blood would soak the grass before she spoke. Sacred fines preserved that order, binding the people to the gods' watch. Yet sagas whisper of men who defied it. One tells of a hot-tempered chieftain who struck his rival with the butt of a spear during the Thing. The law, speaker's voice thundered, demanding he pay not only silver, but also banishment from the district for 2 winters. His kin bent their heads in shame as he left the circle, for though he still breathed, he walked as a man unmoored, cursed for defiling the god's peace. Another tale speaks of raiders who set fire near a temple grove. The ashes blew back upon their own farms, as if the land spirits themselves rose to avenge the insult. The fines were steep, but the true weight lay in dishonour. To be branded a defiler meant suspicion at every feast, cold stares at every gathering. No oath sworn by such a man rang true, for the gods themselves had seen him strike within their own precinct. Even if silver was paid, even if exile was endured, the memory of the deed lingered like smoke in the rafters of a hall. For the Vikings, sacred spaces were not simply places, they were the pillars holding up the fragile order of the world. To wound them was to invite ruin, for both gods and men would rise against the one who forgot where peace must stand. Thus the law carved deep, setting sacred fines that weighed heavier than any chest of silver, to remind all that even in an age of axe and blood, there must be ground where only words, oaths, and offerings held sway. In the Viking world, law was not the sole burden of men. Women, too, stood within its circle, their voices heard at the Thing, their rights protected and punished by the same customs that bound their husbands, brothers, and fathers. Yet, the line of justice was drawn differently across the lives of women, weaving threads of power, peril, and sometimes terrible consequence. A Viking woman entered marriage not as chattel, but as bearer of dowry and keeper of keys. The dowry she brought into the union was her shield, wealth that remained tied to her even when she stepped into her husband's hall. If a man squandered her dowry, or if disputes rose about its return, the law bent sharp in her favour. Kin would gather to speak for her, and the Thing could demand repayment in silver or cattle. The loss of a dowry was no small matter. It struck at the honour of both families, for a woman's wealth was bound to her standing. Divorce, too, stood within her grasp. Unlike in many other lands of the age, a Viking woman could cast aside a husband who mistreated her, who struck her with unjust hand, or who failed in his duties as provider. To claim this right, she needed no written parchment, only the courage to stand before witnesses. 3 times she might declare herself parted from him, once at the hearth, once at the door, and once at the Thing, and the bond was broken. The dowry returned to her, the children often left in her care, and she walked free, her honour intact. Such strength shocked many who came to trade or raid with the North, but among the Vikings it was carved into law as firmly as rune upon stone. Yet the law's edge could cut deeply against women as well. Crimes of adultery, if proved, carried penalties harsher for a wife than for her husband. A Viking man who strayed faced the anger of kin, but seldom the full wrath of the Thing. A woman, if caught in such betrayal, risked shame, loss of dowry, and in rare, darker tales, drowning in the sea. The sagas whisper of such judgments, grim endings, where a woman bound and cast into the waves was meant to wash her sin from the world. These were not common, but their shadow lingered, warning every woman of the perils that might follow dishonour. Exile, too, was sometimes the sentence. A woman accused of witchcraft, of weaving seether in ways that frightened her kin, might be driven from her homeland. To lose hearth and hall was to lose life itself, for survival alone in the wild was a death sentence. Even so, some endured, whispering charms in lonely valleys, feared yet remembered long after their bodies had turned to dust. Despite these shadows, the rights of Viking women stood taller than those of many beyond the northern seas. They could inherit property, manage farms, and settle disputes in their husband's absence. Their words at the Thing carried weight, especially when kin supported them. Skalds sang not only of Viking men-at-arms, but of women whose wisdom and sharp tongues carved justice as surely as any sword. Still, the law was a heavy yoke, and its balance uneven. Where it granted strength, it also bore down with harshness, reminding every woman that honour was a double-edged blade. To keep it bright, she must walk carefully, guarding her dowry, her hearth, her name. For in the Viking world, law did not forget, and a woman's fate, whether in silver, freedom, or exile, was written as firmly as a man's upon the stones of the Thing. The Vikings lived in a world where the veil between seen and unseen was thin as morning mist. Storms could rise without warning, crops could wither, children could sicken, and when no sword nor plough could explain such fate, whispers turned toward sorcery. Seither, the weaving of hidden threads, was feared and revered in equal measure. To wield it was to touch the will of the gods and the darker spirits that haunted the night. But among the people, suspicion was sharp, and when fear grew heavy, the law itself was drawn against those who bore the mark of witchcraft. Seither was most often the work of women, seeresses who sat cloaked in furs and feathers, chanting upon high seats, their staffs trembling with power. A Viking man might seek them in secret, asking if his voyage would find treasure or death, if his harvest would feed his hall or starve it. But respect was edged with fear, For Seithr dealt not in open strength, but in hidden weaving. To call storms, to twist minds, to bind desire, these were powers that unsettled the warrior's code of steel and honour. More perilous still was the man who took up Seithr. For in the Viking world, magic of this kind was seen as unmanly, a stain upon his honour. To be called ergi, soft, womanish, was itself near enough to start a blood feud, and a man who bent his will towards Seithr risked that very accusation. The sagas tell of such figures, men whispered about in corners, avoided at feasts, their names laced with contempt. To master magic was to invite isolation, and sometimes worse. When suspicion flared high, the thing itself could turn upon the accused. A woman rumoured to sour the milk of cows, or to blight the catch of fish, might be brought before the assembly. Kin might defend her, offering oaths to shield her honour, but if the whispers grew too loud, punishment followed. At times it was exile, casting her into the wilderness, where even the spirits she served could not shelter her from hunger. At times, darker still, death was decreed, for the people feared the contagion of hidden power. The Vikings believed that sorcery twisted not only the air, but the bonds of society. A Viking child who wasted with fever, while others thrived, might spark suspicion that a neighbour's hand, unseen, had cursed him. A Viking woman who stirred too many secrets, whose eyes lingered too long, might find herself branded a witch. The fear was not always just, but it was always strong, for in a world ruled by fate, those who dared to meddle with its threads stood apart, and apart was dangerous. And yet Seithr endured. Kings and jarls themselves sought prophecy, hungry to know what battles lay before them. Some sagas speak of rulers who guarded their seeresses with swords, even as they feared their whispers. Others turned suspicion into spectacle, punishing witches not merely for justice, but to show the people that the god's order still held sway. The line between reverence and ruin was razor thin, and those who walked it risked falling with every step. So it was that sorcery, Seithr, and suspicion lived within the law's shadow. The Vikings did not wholly banish magic, for they could not live without it, but they punished it when it threatened kin, when fear turned to unrest, when whispers grew too heavy to bear. The staff and the chant, the rune and the curse, they were both shield and peril, and those who wielded them learned quickly that power in secret is never free. It comes always with suspicion, and in the north, suspicion could kill as surely as the edge of an axe. When the old gods still walked in every grove and storm, the Vikings trusted oath, feud, and steel to settle quarrels. But as the cross crept northward, a new kind of judgment entered their world, trial by ordeal. No longer would the thing alone weigh a man's word against another. Now fire and water themselves were called to speak, their searing touch believed to reveal guilt or innocence under the eye of the white Christ. To many, it was strange sorcery dressed as faith, yet it took root, for men hungered for certainty when honour and silver failed. The ordeal was harsh and simple. A Viking man accused of theft or blasphemy might be brought before the priest and commanded to grasp a bar of iron heated until it glowed red, or plunge his arm into a cauldron of boiling water to seize a stone from the depths. If the wound healed clean in the days that followed, God had spoken, the man was innocent. If the flesh blackened, festered, or failed to mend, guilt was declared, and punishment fell. No oath, no kinship, no Viking child's plea could undo what fire and water proclaimed. For a people used to trials of combat, it was a strange sight. Here was no shield wall, no holmgang on a hide-stretched field. Here stood a man trembling not before another warrior's axe, but before the silent judgment of the elements. Many muttered that it stripped a man of his honour, for it left fate in the hands of priests rather than his own courage. Yet others found comfort in it, for where feud threatened to spiral, the ordeal gave an ending that could not be argued. Women, too, faced the ordeal. A Viking woman, accused of adultery, witchcraft, or theft might be forced to walk barefoot across 9 red-hot ploughshares. Each step burned flesh and pride alike, and as with men, her innocence was judged by how her wounds fared in the days after. Such trials were spoken of in whispers long after, half in awe, half in fear, for they blended the old reverence for ordeal with the stern hand of the new faith. The sagas remember moments when ordeal tipped the balance of great disputes. In one tale, a man accused of stealing cattle swore his innocence, but could not find kin willing to pledge oaths for him. He was set to the boiling cauldron. When his hand came forth blistered and raw, the people shook their heads, and his guilt was sealed. Another speaks of a chieftain's daughter who faced the ploughshares. Her feet healed clean, and the crowd proclaimed it a sign of divine favour. Her accuser was shamed, his honour broken beyond repair. But ordeal was not merely a tool of justice, it was also a tool of power. Priests and kings favoured it, for it bent the people toward the authority of God's law and away from the ancient ways of feud and vengeance. In time, the thing began to accept ordeal as binding, weaving it into the fabric of law. A Viking man who once demanded holmgang now found himself standing before boiling water instead, his fate decided not by steel but by silence and prayer. Still, suspicion lingered. Many warriors scoffed that a blistered hand proved nothing but bad luck, that a festering wound could come as easily from filth as from guilt. Yet the tide of faith was strong, and the ordeal spread, carried by those who claimed that God's judgment was truer than man's. So trial by ordeal marked the dawn of change in the north, a moment when the Vikings' world bent beneath the weight of the cross. Where once only the gods of storm and war were called to witness, now fire and water bore the voice of a single God. To stand before them was to feel the clash of old and new, the raw fury of the elements bound to the rising shadow of Christ. And for those who endured it, innocence or guilt was not just decided by men, but by the searing hand of heaven itself. When silver could not mend a wound, when feud ran too deep for arbitration, and when the weight of crime demanded more than exile, the Vikings turned to the starkest judgment of all death. Hanging, beheading, and the gallows hill stood as the final tools of law, grim reminders that even in a world ruled by kinship and honour, some deeds could only be answered by the ending of a life. The gallows hill was often set apart from the farmsteads and temples, a bare mound rising against the sky. There, a Viking man condemned by thing or chieftain was led with rope about his neck. To hang was no glorious fate. It was shame, the body swaying in the wind as carrion birds circled. Saga men called it Odin's sacrifice, for the High One himself had hung upon the world tree, but among mortals it carried little honour. To see a neighbour strung from the beam was to see his name blackened forever, his kin forced to bear the weight of disgrace. Beheading carried a different meaning. It was swift, clean, final. A condemned man knelt, often upon a skin or stone, and the axe or sword fell sharp. Here was no prolonged display, but the severed head itself told its tale, sometimes placed on a pole, sometimes delivered to the kin of the slain. A Viking child might shudder at the sight, yet the act was not wanton. It was law, declaring that some crimes murder without cause, betrayal of kin, sorcery beyond forgiveness were too heavy for fines. Only blood upon the ground could balance them. The sagas preserve these punishments in chilling detail. In one tale, a thief who returned again and again to his neighbour's herds was finally brought to the gallows hill, his pleas unanswered as the noose tightened. Another tells of a chieftain's retainer who slew his master in drunken rage. No wergild was offered, for the crime was too foul. He was beheaded at dawn, his head displayed before the hall as a warning. Such stories were carved into memory so that Viking children would know. Dishonour led not only to shame, but to death made public. Hanging and beheading were not the first choices of Viking law. The thing preferred settlement, wergild, or exile, for killing a man too often sowed new feuds. But when oaths shattered, when blood cried out with no peace possible, then the gallows or axe rose as the last voice of justice. Even kings, though cloaked in power, could meet such ends if their rule turned sour. The law was harsh, but it was not blind. Those who defied it stood equal beneath its shadow. The gallows hill itself carried power. To pass it was to remember the weight of law, to feel the hush that lingered where men had swung. Some feared the restless dead that clung to such places, believing that oath-breakers and thieves hung unshriven might wander in the night, seeking vengeance. Travellers marked these hills in silence, for they were not only sites of punishment, but thresholds where honour and shame crossed into the other world. Thus the Vikings tempered their freedom with fear. Hanging, beheading, and the gallows hill reminded all that though feud and silver might often heal wounds, the community itself held the final say. And when that say demanded death, it was carried out not in secrecy, but in full sight, where the people, the gods, and the earth itself bore witness. In this way, the law of the North stood unflinching. A Viking man could live bold, feast well, and raid far. But if he turned his hand against the fabric of kin and honour, his last sight might be the sky above the gallows, or the flash of the axe before darkness claimed him. In a world where honour was life and memory outlived flesh, the Vikings wielded not only exile and death, but punishments that scarred a man's body as a living warning. Mutilation and marking were not common, yet when used, they spoke louder than any fine of silver. A Viking man with a missing ear or slit nose carried his crime with him into every hall, into every feast, into every gaze that fell upon him. It was punishment that walked with the condemned until his dying breath. The law favoured balance, wergild for blood, feud for feud, but some crimes demanded a lesson carved into the flesh itself. Thieves were among the first to bear such marks. When caught too often, when fines failed, and exile was judged too soft, his fingers might be shorn away, leaving him unable to wield blade or plough. The loss was both practical and symbolic. A thief had taken what was not his, and now he lost the very tools with which men shaped their lives. A Viking child staring at such a hand would not forget the lesson, nor dare repeat it. Noses, too, were sometimes cut away. To mutilate the face was to strip a man of his standing, to brand him as untrustworthy for all to see. The sagas whisper of such punishments meted upon oath-breakers, or men who had shamed their kin beyond repair. A noseless face was a mark worse than a burned hall, for it could not be rebuilt. At every feast, as Viking food was passed down the benches, his deformity reminded all of his disgrace. Even laughter, should it come, was hollow, for no man could truly forget what he saw. Ears were also taken. A single ear severed was sometimes the penalty for those who had betrayed secrets, gossiping where silence was owed. It left the man shorn and humbled, a visible mark of his loose tongue. Worse still, it left him mocked, for without an ear he was seen as one who could no longer listen, as though fate itself declared him unfit for oaths. The greatest cruelty of these punishments was not the pain of the knife or axe, it was the living shame. Outlaws could at least run into the wild, free of men's eyes. The hanged swung once and were gone. But the mutilated lived on, forced to endure stares, whispers, and the knowledge that no kin, no silver, no deed could restore what had been cut away. They were bodies turned into law codes, flesh that carried the memory of crime. Women, too, could face such sentences, though more rarely. Tales speak of noses sliced from those caught in adultery, their beauty turned to ruin, their shame proclaimed without word. In such grim acts, the community showed that punishment need not always kill, it could, instead haunt, lingering like a wound that never healed. These punishments were rare, for the Vikings understood their power. If used too often, they would cheapen the law, but when used sparingly, they struck with unforgettable force. To see a noseless man at market, to pass a fingerless hand upon the road, was to be reminded of the line one dared not cross. Even in death, such marks endured, for a mutilated corpse buried in the earth carried its shame into saga and story, where children learned what fate awaited those who mocked the law. So, mutilation and marking stood as grim but potent tools. They were the scars of law itself, etched into skin and bone. A Viking man might survive the knife, might live for years afterward, but he lived as a warning, not as a peer. For in the north, it was not enough to punish. The law demanded that punishment be seen, remembered, and carved into the very body of the condemned, so that all who looked upon him would know, here is dishonour made flesh. To be declared an outlaw in the Viking world was to be unmade. No axe stroke fell, no gallows creaked, yet the sentence was death in all but swiftness. The thing's voice cast the man beyond law and kinship, and from that moment he was no longer counted among men. His home, his hearth, his seat at the feast, all vanished as though they had never been. What remained was the outlaw's road, a path of hunger, fear, and shadow, walked until death found him in some lonely place. The outlaw had no roof but the forest canopy, no walls but the cliffs and caves. In summer, he might scrape by, for the woods held berries, the streams fish, and the fields, if he dared creep near them, loose ears of grain. But when winter set its iron hand upon the land, the outlaw's lot grew cruel. A Viking man in exile could not share Viking food at the hearth, could not trade for salt or bread. He gnawed roots, tore meat raw from whatever beast he could snare, or starved. More than one outlaw was found stiff in the snow, clutching a meagre bundle of sticks as if fire might still save him. Worse than hunger was the knowledge that every hand was turned against him. To strike an outlaw was no crime, it was praised. Any man who met him on the path could kill him and claim his goods without shame. Even kin could not shelter him, for to feed or clothe an outlaw was itself a punishable deed. Thus he wandered, hunted not only by the cold but by those who once drank from the same horn beside him. The outlaw walked always with eyes over his shoulder, for any step could be his last. Some outlaws turned wolf in truth, raiding lone farms at night, stealing cattle or grain in desperate defiance. For a while they might live, a shadow on the edge of the community, their names whispered like curses. Yet their doom came soon, for no man could stand alone forever against a village bound together by law and kinship. A band of farmers, a spear in the dark, or a sudden ambush upon the road, these were the ends that met most who trod that path. The sagas tell of rare outlaws who made themselves legends, men who gathered fellow exiles into bands, haunting the high valleys or the islands of the fjords, striking back at those who had cast them out. Yet even their tales end the same, with blood in the snow, with betrayal by one seeking pardon, with heads struck from bodies and brought back to the thing as proof. The outlaw might carve a brief saga in violence, but never a lasting one. What made this punishment so feared was its slow cruelty. To hang was swift, to lose a hand sharp and final. But to walk the outlaw's road was to die each day a little more. To see smoke rising from farms you could never enter, to smell Viking food carried on the wind while your belly gnawed itself hollow, to hear children's laughter where your own name was cursed, these were torments sharper than steel. Even in burial the outlaw was denied. Many were left unburied, their bones scattered by wolves, their souls said to wander restless. Some were buried in marshes or beneath cairns of stone, marked not with runes of memory but with silence. For the Vikings believed that the outlaw had severed himself from the order of men and gods, and so his fate after death was as lonely as his path in life. Thus the outlaw's road was the harshest exile of all. It stripped a man not only of kin and hall, but of his very place in the weave of the world. And so the Vikings feared it, for every free man knew to walk beyond law was to walk alone, hunted by hunger, winter, and the hand of every stranger, until the earth itself swallowed you. There was a time when the howl of the berserk struck awe and terror alike. On the battlefield, when shields locked and the air rang with iron, a berserk's fury could break the line, his axe biting like the jaws of Fenrir. Yet what made glory in war brought chaos at home. When such men carried their madness into halls and markets, when their eyes rolled white and their mouths frothed with rage, the Vikings learned that fury unchained was as dangerous to kin as to foes. Thus came laws and bans, forged not by fear alone, but by the need to bind even the wildest spirits within the frame of order. The sagas tell of berserks who, drunk on mead and pride, turned feasts into slaughter. A Viking man boasting at the hearth might find himself suddenly beneath the crushing grip of one who mistook insult for challenge. Tables overturned, Viking food spilled across the floor, children screaming as blades flashed where laughter had been. Such rampages mocked the peace of the hall, and kings soon saw that a warrior useful in war was poison in times of calm. To brawl was not uncommon in the north. Men jostled for honour, quick with insult and quicker with steel. But there was a difference between a feud settled in holmgang and a berserk's madness that spared neither friend nor foe. The Thing and the kings drew sharp lines. Laws declared that berserks who rampaged within the community could be fined, outlawed, even slain without penalty. What had once been admired as god-touched fury was now branded as threat. King Eric Bloodaxe, the sagas say, moved hard against them. He declared berserks unlawful if they used their battle trance in the peace of settlements. Others followed, for kings sought order in their realms, and no order could stand while berserks roamed unchecked. By such bans, the very image of the berserk shifted. Where once he was a symbol of fearlessness, now he was a warning of wildness untamed, a beast that must be cast out. Still, the berserk spirit was not easily extinguished. Some men wore wolfskins or bearskins in defiance, claiming their fury as gift of Odin. They wandered, offering their strength as mercenaries, shunned in some places, prized in others. Yet even their fame could not escape the shadow of the law. Communities grew weary of blood spilled at weddings, of markets shattered by sudden rage. The cost of their power was too heavy, and so they were pushed to the edges of the north, remembered more in story than in law. The bans against berserks reveal much of the Viking mind. Even in an age of raids and war, the people craved peace at hearth and field. A Viking woman baking bread for her kin could not do so safely if berserks stormed through the doorway. A Viking child could not grow strong if fear stalked every feast. The law did not erase fury from the north, but it sought to bind it, to keep it where it belonged upon the battlefield, not within the home. Thus, berserks, brawls, and ban became entwined in memory. The wild men were not forgotten. They strode through saga and song as terrifying figures, half man, half beast, but they were remembered also as a lesson. Power without bounds breeds ruin. Fury without law devours its own kin. And so the kings of the north, sharpened by the need for order, set their hand against berserks at home, proving that even the fiercest spirit must bow to the weight of law. In this way, the Vikings carved balance between rage and rule. They did not deny the storm, but they fenced it, channeling its might where it served rather than destroyed. The berserk's howl might still echo in the sagas, but in the villages and halls, the law's voice was stronger. It said plain, "Here, within these walls, fury bows to peace, or it is cast out into silence." At sea, the Vikings left behind the Thing's open field and the watchful eyes of kin, yet law still clung to the timbers of their ships. For on the long serpent prows that cut across fjords and oceans, discipline was as vital as sail and oar. Shipboard justice was swift, for a single act of theft, defiance, or cowardice could doom not only one Viking man but the entire crew. In the salt spray and endless horizon, judgment was not postponed until landfall. The sea itself became the court. and the ship its gallows, its prison, and its hall of law. Each man aboard a warship or trader knew his share. The silver from raids, the furs from trade, the casks of Viking food or ale, all were counted and divided by custom. A helmsman or steersman took more, the warriors their portion, the rowers theirs, yet fairness was demanded. To cheat, the division was to tear apart the fellowship that kept the ship afloat. A thief, caught hiding coin or bread, risked more than shame. He risked being cast into the sea, his body claimed by the waves as swiftly as his honour was lost. Order on deck was no less strict. A ship was no place for quarrels, for the planks beneath were thin, and a single fight could topple mast or spill blood where no healer stood. A Viking child might grow up hearing tales of crews that tore themselves apart before ever reaching foreign shores. To prevent such ruin, captains enforced peace with harsh words or sharper blows. Brawlers could be lashed to the mast in sight of all, their pride broken by the laughter and scorn of their fellows. Cowardice at sea was the gravest sin. When storm winds howled and oars bent against the tide, each man was bound to his duty. To falter, to lay down the oar, to shrink from battle when the enemy's sail rose upon the horizon, such acts were branded treachery. Some were cast ashore penniless at the next landing, their names carried in disgrace to the thing. Others, when the fury of their crew was high, were slain on the spot, their bodies dropped into the dark waters as offerings to the sea. The sagas recall both justice and treachery at sea. One tells of a steersman who hoarded the best of the catch on a trading voyage, keeping dried fish and grain for himself while his fellows gnawed on scraps. When his theft was uncovered, he was bound, beaten, and left without rations until he swore an oath never again to betray the hand that rode beside him. Another tale whispers of a Viking band whose leader grew cruel, seizing more than his share of silver after a raid. His men turned upon him in the night, striking him down with axe and spear before naming another in his place. The sea was too narrow for tyranny, and law at sea was written as much in blood as in custom. Still, shipboard justice was not mere cruelty, it was survival. Far from home, there was no thing to hear disputes, no kin to ransom or avenge. A longship's strength lay in unity. Each Viking man had to trust that the one beside him would not falter, that his share of spoils would be fair, that his food would not be stolen in the dark. Justice afloat was the rope that bound crew to ship and ship to fate. Thus, the sea carried its own law, hard and uncompromising. A ship that drifted into chaos soon foundered, its crew scattered, its name forgotten. But a ship where justice held firm, sailed far, returned laden with wealth, and carved its place into saga. Shipboard justice, harsh though it was, reminded every Viking man that the sea spared no fools. Only those who rowed in unity, who shared in fairness, and who upheld the law even on the shifting waves, would see home again. The old world of the Vikings had long rested on oaths sworn at the Thing, with the gods and ancestors as witness. A man's word bound him more tightly than iron, and breaking it was a wound upon his honour. Yet with the coming of kings who reached beyond their clan, and with the cross rising where Thor's hammer once stood, oaths gained a new weight. No longer were they only bargains between kin or neighbours. They became chains that tied men to crown and church, and with them came new crimes, blasphemy, church theft, defiance of royal law punishments sharper than before, for they were said to cut against heaven itself. When a Viking man bent his knee to a king, it was no small thing. His hands clasped upon the rulers, his oath rang out before warriors and priests alike, and from that moment his loyalty was not only personal, it was political. To break such an oath was treason, no longer settled by wergild or feud. The king's wrath was heavier than a clan's vengeance, for it carried not just the steel of his men, but the judgment of the realm. The outlawry that followed was deeper, the punishments harsher, and the gallows rose more swiftly when royal oaths were shattered. So too with the church. As Christ's priests built their halls of stone and timber, as bells tolled where once horns had sounded, new laws followed. Theft from a church was not treated as common stealing. To take chalice, book, or relic was to mock the very God the people were told, now reigned above Odin himself. The fines for such deeds were steep, often many times greater than for raiding a neighbour's storehouse, and if the thief could not pay, his body bore the price. A Viking child might grow up hearing tales of men blinded, mutilated, or driven from their land for daring to touch holy treasures. Blasphemy, too, emerged as a crime. To curse the name of Christ, to scorn the cross, to mock the holy rites, these were no longer mere insults at feasts, but offences brought before bishops and kings. Some sagas tell of men fined, others of harsher fates, exile, mutilation, even death, if their words were thought to endanger the faith of others. Where once the sharpest insults were neath and ergi, now words against heaven could end a life. Yet the Vikings did not abandon their old ways overnight. Oaths to kings and church were layered upon the ancient bonds of kin and land. A Viking woman might still swear by the earth beneath her feet, even as a priest demanded she swear also by the cross. A farmer might offer bread and ale at Yule to both Christ and the old gods, uncertain which power held greater sway. In this mingling, law grew heavier, for men could now be judged by two masters, the crown above and the altar beside. Kings welcomed this change, for it bound the people more tightly to their rule. By swearing oaths, not only before kin but also before God, loyalty gained a sacred sheen. To rise against the king was painted not only as rebellion, but as sin. Bishops, too, gained their place at the thing, their voices shaping law, their hands guiding punishment. Crimes against the church struck deeper than wounds against any man, for they threatened the new order itself. Thus the Viking world shifted. Oaths to kings and church reshaped justice, carving new lines of loyalty and new punishments for those who strayed. A Viking man who once feared only feud or exile now faced the gallows for mocking a priest, the lash for stealing from the altar, and the branding of traitor if he broke faith with his king. The law was no longer only the voice of kin, it was the voice of realm and heaven together, and it spoke with iron teeth. Of all the punishments whispered in the sagas, none chills the blood like the so-called blood eagle. To hear it told, the condemned was seized, laid prone, and his back carved open, so that ribs were broken outward like wings, lungs drawn forth in a grotesque parody of flight. It was said to be an offering to Odin, a death so cruel it would brand terror into all who watched. Yet in the cold light of law and custom, the question lingers. Was the blood eagle ever truly wrought upon Viking flesh, or was it poetry's cruel invention, a tale sharpened by scalds to pierce the memory of men? The sagas name it, most famously in the fate of King Ella of Northumbria, slain by Ragnar Lothbrok's sons, in vengeance for their father. They say the brothers carved the eagle on Eyjar's back, a deed sung by poets as proof of their wrath. But sagas are not law codes, and in the thing's memory no punishment so gruesome is recorded. A Viking man condemned for murder faced outlawry, beheading, or hanging harsh, but bound by order. Nowhere do the codes speak of ribs split and lungs unfurled. Still, poetry was power, and the skalds wove cruelty into song to magnify triumph. To say a foe was given the blood eagle was to say he suffered more than death, that his end was shaped into myth. A Viking child listening at the hearth to such verses would shudder, not knowing if the image was real or dream, yet the fear would serve its purpose. In a world where vengeance had to be feared as much as carried out, the story of the blood eagle was itself a weapon. Some scholars of the North believe it was never meant as literal, but as metaphor. To carve an eagle on a man's back might mean simply to slash it open with a blade, leaving the marks of wings. Others think it was a skaldic riddle, a kenning for execution, made darker with each retelling until flesh and bone were imagined as wings. And yet, there are those who argue that, at least once, in fury or ritual, men might have carried out such a horror to honour Odin with blood. Whether fact or fear, the punishment carries the weight of meaning. The eagle was Odin's bird, soaring over battlefields, bearing the souls of the slain. To give a man the blood eagle was to turn his very body into sacrifice, a brutal offering to the All-Father. It was not a sentence of law, but a spectacle of vengeance, more curse than judgment. The Vikings valued order as much as fury, and their justice was built on balance: silver for wounds, exile for crimes, death when all else failed. Yet the blood eagle, if it ever happened, broke that balance. It was vengeance made into ritual theatre, where cruelty replaced order, and pain became the language of power. Perhaps that is why it lived in story more than in law, a shadow punishment that haunted the edges of memory. So the debate endures. Was the blood eagle ever carved in truth, or only in song? The sagas leave their hints, the skalds their riddles, but the thing's stones are silent. What remains is the image, sharp and terrible, of a man broken into wings beneath the sky. And in that image lies the real power, not in whether the Vikings truly spread ribs to the wind, but in how the story itself endured, making every enemy wonder if such a fate might await him. In the end, the blood eagle was less law than legend, but in legend it still cuts. In the Viking world, a sword could kill a man, but a poem could unmake him. Skalds, the keepers of song and memory, carried more than verses in their mouths. They carried power sharper than steel. Their praise could lift a Viking man's name to the rafters of every hall, binding his honour to glory that outlived him. But their satire, their biting lampoons, could tear that honour apart, leaving him mocked, shamed, and despised. In a society where reputation was life itself, the skald's tongue was a weapon, and the law treated it as such. A skald's gift was to weave truth and insult so tightly that none could pull them apart. To be called brave in verse was to be remembered as such. To be called cowardly was to be branded with shame, even if the words were lies. A Viking child at the hearth, hearing his father's name praised in song, grew tall with pride. But if that same child heard his kin ridiculed, if the skald's voice painted them as weak or dishonourable, the wound cut deeper than any axe. For the song spread further than feud. It echoed across fjord and farm, carried by every tongue that repeated it. Because of this, the law weighed words heavily. The neath, the insult that struck at a man's honour or manhood, was treated nearly as grave as bloodshed. To accuse a man of cowardice, of ergi, of being less than what a warrior must be, could set feud aflame. And when such insults were delivered in verse, the sting doubled, for poetry was memory's chain. A man might deny an insult spoken in passing, but a lampoon sung in alliterating lines could not be erased. It lived, carried forward, immortalized in song. The sagas are filled with such tales. One skald, angered at a chieftain who refused him welcome, crafted a verse so mocking that the man could not walk into the thing without laughter trailing him. Another, seeking mercy for his life, composed a drapa so splendid that the very king who meant to kill him instead showered him with gifts. Words could ruin, and words could save. The sword might take a man's life, but the skald's tongue decided how he would be remembered. Kings both feared and favoured skalds. A skald at one side was an ally of memory, ensuring that victories were sung and failures forgotten. Yet a skald wronged could become an enemy more dangerous than a blade, for ridicule once spoken could not be silenced. Some kings sought to bind skalds with gifts, showering them with rings, cloaks, and even Viking food and drink at their tables, hoping loyalty would keep their tongues sharp only for others. Still, satire thrived, for a true skald bowed to no one's pride. The law did not ignore such power. A lampoon that mocked a man's honour could be brought to the thing as a case for feud or fine. Some men demanded wergild for wounded honour, others blood to wash away the sting of verse. In this way, poetry was not mere entertainment, it was legal dynamite, a force that could topple reputations and redraw the bonds between men. And yet, the Vikings cherished this danger, for poetry was the marrow of their memory. Without the skalds, their deeds would vanish like mist. Their world lived in verse, carved into runes and sung into feasts, shaping the sagas that still breathe today. To fear a skald's tongue was to respect the power of words, a power that no sword could cut down. So it was that skalds, satire, and the sword of words ruled beside axe and shield. A Viking man could guard his farm, his kin, and his gold, but he could never fully guard his name from the skald's tongue. In that balance of praise and lampoon, of glory and disgrace, the North found its truest law, that words, once spoken, endure beyond death, binding or breaking men more surely than steel. Among the Vikings, justice was harsh, yet it was not without its softer edge. For though feud and outlawry tore men apart, there was also the deep yearning to heal, to draw enemies back into the circle, and to mend what rage had broken. Mercy, redemption, and return. These were not the ways of weak men, but the tools of wisdom. For a Viking man knew that endless bloodshed drained the strength of farms, emptied halls, and left Viking children fatherless. Better, when the time was right, to bind wounds with silver, with oaths, and with the clasping of hands. Ransom stood foremost among these bridges. To take a man in battle or raid was not always to slay him. His kin might pay in silver, goods, or land, and so redeem his life. A chieftain captured in war might return home with dignity, for the ransom price itself was proof of his worth. No one wasted treasure on a man of no standing. Thus ransom could turn defeat into honour, reminding all that even in chains a warrior's value endured. A Viking child, watching a freed man return with gifts exchanged, would learn that not every capture ended in blood, and that wealth could unbind fetters as surely as keys. Reconciliation came harder, for it demanded not only silver but humility. A feud begun in anger could consume generations, yet there were moments when men chose peace. At the Thing, mediators stepped forward, kin of both sides, wise men, or sometimes women, whose words carried the weight of hearth and home. They counted the slain, measured the wounds, and set the wergild to match. Then came the oaths, sworn over sacred rings or carved staves, pledges to let the feud die where it stood. To refuse such settlement was to spit on the very fabric of law, to risk outlawry and ruin. To accept was to prove strength of another kind, the courage to end strife. The sagas tell of such moments. One recounts a chieftain whose brother was slain in a drunken brawl. His first instinct was fire and sword, yet the urging of kin drew him to the Thing. There he accepted silver, a marriage alliance, and the fostering of his son in the killer's household. From then on, the two families were bound, not as foes but as kin. Another tale recalls a Viking woman who, tired of endless feuding, walked between armed men and demanded peace. Her boldness shamed them into laying down their weapons. Such acts lived long in memory, for they proved that mercy could build what vengeance only destroyed. Return, too, was possible for the outlaw. Not all banishments were final. Lesser outlawry cast a man out for years, but if he lived, if he showed repentance, if his kin interceded, and his foes agreed, he might be welcomed back. The path was narrow, lined with rituals of oaths and compensation. The outlaw might kneel, placing his head beneath his foe's axe in token of trust, lifted only when mercy was granted. To return was not to erase the past, but to step back into the circle with scars acknowledged and honour painstakingly restored. These steps of mercy were never light. They demanded silver, patience, and courage, but they also gave life back to communities weary of strife. A Viking farm needed strong hands for harvest, not endless graves. A hall thrived on laughter and feasts, not the silence of mourning. Mercy was not weakness, it was foresight, the knowledge that no man, however wronged, could live alone forever in feud. Thus, mercy, redemption, and return stood as the hidden strength of Viking law. Behind the harsh punishments, behind the gallows and the axe, lay the deeper truth, that the North endured not by blood alone, but by the careful weaving of peace. And when an enemy was welcomed back into the circle, when hands clasped across old wounds, the community itself grew stronger, bound tighter than before by the wisdom of those who chose to forgive. The twilight of the old justice came not with a single stroke of sword or decree, but with the slow gathering of kingship and church, pressing upon the free men of the North until the thing itself was reshaped. Where once the circle of stones, the open field, and the law, speaker's voice were the heart of judgment, new powers rose, Christian kings, codified laws, bishops with crosses in hand, who sought to tame the wild justice of feud, outlawry, and blood price. It was the end of an age, though its echoes lingered long. At the thing, every free Viking man had once stood equal beneath the sky, his voice part of the law's breath. The law was memory, held in the mouth of the law speaker, passed through generations like fire across dry grass. Yet memory bends, and kings hungered for words set in iron. The Gulathing in Norway, the Gragas in Iceland, these were written laws, carved into text, no longer shifting with custom. They codified what had once been fluid, narrowing the space for kin to bargain or feud, binding justice closer to crown and cross. The kings welcomed this change, for it drew power into their hands. A Viking, who once settled wrongs with silver and axe, now stood beneath royal officers who claimed the right to punish in the king's name. Theft, once paid by wergild, could now mean flogging or the loss of a hand. Blasphemy, a word unknown to the old gods, became a crime against heaven and crown alike. And where feud had once kept balance among kin, the king declared it murder, punishable not by settlement, but by the gallows. The church's voice grew alongside. Bishops declared the sacredness of oaths sworn on the cross, far heavier than those sworn on Thor's hammer or a ring of iron. To steal from a church was no longer a quarrel over goods, but a sin that placed the soul in peril. Priests urged mercy, yet also demanded obedience, their hands in law as well as prayer. And, with every sermon, the old ways bent further toward the new order. Still, the old justice did not vanish overnight. The sagas show men clinging to feud, women demanding wergild, outlaws running wild in the forests. A Viking child could still grow up hearing both the priest's warning of damnation and the skald's fierce song of vengeance. Even as kings pressed their laws, the people remembered that honour was not easily surrendered to parchment. But the tide could not be turned. With each passing generation, the circle of the thing narrowed, its freedom swallowed by courts and kingsmen. The wild punishments the nithstang raised in scorn, the berserk's brawl in a hall, the outlaw starving in the snow, gave way to gallows, prisons, and fines levied in the king's silver. What had been community's law became crown's command. Yet something of the old ways endured. Even in the age of Christian kings, the memory of feud, of outlawry, of silver weighed for wounds, lingered in the hearts of the people. The sagas preserved them, not only as tales of the past, but as reminders of what had once bound kin together. And though the twilight of the old justice dimmed their light, it did not snuff it out. In the stubborn memory of the North, the wild law of the Vikings lived on, carved not only in codices, but in story, in song, and in the unyielding spirit of a people who had once measured honour by axe and oath beneath the open sky.